Unsettling the Colonial Narrative, the story of 11 Aboriginal women and girls told through the archive. Speaking from Toowoomba today, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this country, the Gayabal, Jadawar and Western Waka Waka peoples, and recognise their continuing connection to the land, sea, sky and stars. We pay our respects to Elders past and present and to all First Nations peoples who are online today. I'd also like to acknowledge my ancestors, the Budgery peoples of southwest Queensland. Budgery peoples country is located within the Bulu and Paru Shire councils, encompassing the towns of Yulo and Hungerford. As river people of the Paru River, our traditional country takes in the Currawinya National Park, Burrara Lakes and the Currawinya Lakes. We must always remember that under the concrete and asphalt, this is traditional Aboriginal land, and these are lands on which sovereignty has never been ceded. As we walk on Aboriginal land each day, always remember to tread lightly. Just a warning before I speak today, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people should be aware that this presentation contains the voices and names of deceased Aboriginal people in printed material. Some material may contain terms that reflect authors' views or those of the period in which the item was written or recorded, but may not be considered appropriate today, such as blood quantum terms. While the information may not reflect current understanding, it is provided in an historical context. This presentation also examines Aboriginal suicide within archival records and includes the names of Aboriginal women and girls who have died. The paper discusses traumatic events within this context and does include the photo of a deceased Aboriginal girl. Just a little bit about the background to my PhD project. In my PhD, I examined the coronial records of 11 Aboriginal women and girls who died in suspicious circumstances in Queensland during a period of more than 50 years, beginning in the late 1880s and documenting events across the regions until 1945. Using coronial inquest files based on the Inquest of Death Act of 1866 and the Coroners Act of 1930, together with additional primary sources and secondary sources, my research project explores the settler colonial landscape of Queensland with an interest in the disclosures of social histories, social relations, imaginaries, as well as the impacts of laws. The structure of the inquest file itself included a description of the body, certificate of particulars, cause of death, identity of those giving witness statements, police report, and whether someone had been accused. The 11 files in my thesis include overlapping narratives of the agents investigating their deaths, both in official reports and in witness statements. One Aboriginal reserve is the focus of 2 inquests with Lily and Shirley. On Palm Island Reserve, 6 inquests involve the death of Aboriginal women, Eliza, Emily, my great-great-great-great-grandmother, Grace, Jessie, Lily and Shirley, and 5 inquests involve the death of Aboriginal girls, Winnie 15, Lizzie 17, Beatty 16 to 17 years, Sissy 13 and Polly 9. My thesis does not include any inquests from the Torres Strait. And in addition to offering an analysis of Queensland's settler colonial landscape in both rural and regional areas, the choice of these files for this study highlights the constraints and exorbitant expense associated with carrying out a coronial investigation in a remote location. The 11 inquests in my thesis reveal that Aboriginal identified as Gin, half-caste, domestic, servant, Abo and black were the distinguishing marks on female bodies. Witnesses and government officials also reported that they were drunk, dangerous and desirable. When this is combined with the narratives of property owners, justices of the peace, police constables and doctors, the story of these women and girls become buried deep within the coronial structures and colonial discourses of the inquest file. These files also contain marginal notes, words crossed out and phrases blacked out, highlighting some of the inconsistencies, fears, flaws and mistakes of the settler colonial in the practice of investigating a suspicious death. This is reflected in terms of what was printed, what could not be seen, who was allowed to speak and who was spoken for. Therefore, exploring the words and phrases spoken by the Aboriginal woman and girl before death, the archival record provides a discursive space for the deceased where Aboriginal agency is present, rupturing and dismantling from within to unsettle the settler state. Through their words and movements in the inquest, Aboriginal girls and women emerge as something more than voiceless victims, instead speaking, acting and moving as individuals in a social world. For this reason, my PhD seeks to humanise and personalise these women and girls as mothers, daughters, wives and sisters by questioning the settler colonial imaginary and the legacies of colonial authority. And there also too is my central research question from the thesis. Approaching inquest reports as a space of multiple narratives and social identities expressed in the words and actions of various witnesses, including the deceased. What can coronial investigations into the deaths of Aboriginal females in Queensland tell us about how their lives were investigated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries? In today's presentation, I will present a summary of each of the 11 files, a really quick summary as well, pointing out some of the inconsistencies, gaps and silences in the evidence. Coupled with this is the mark of Aboriginality on their skin as visible through blood quantum terms, through descriptions of them as uncontrollable in terms of behaviour and their inevitable permeability as the doomed or dying race. As Leslie Erickson argues in her study of 19th and early 20th century inquest files of Aboriginal women in Canada, quote, the imposed structure of the inquest permitted government officials, jurors and journalists to manipulate investigations and media accounts of suicide to provide concrete proof that Aboriginal peoples were in need of further protection, regulation and surveillance because they were pathologically drunken, criminal and suicidal. The story of 11 Aboriginal women and girls told through the archive. Eliza, no surname, was found dead in a mine shaft on the 11th of December 1888 near the Ravenswood State School. An inquiry by Senior Sergeant Carney was held into her death on the 12th of December concerning, quote, the cause of death of a black gin named Eliza. Mr. H. Barton Esquire, Justice of the Peace JP, stated in his summary that, quote, it appears to me that she lost her life by accidentally falling down the shaft of an old mine whilst under the influence of liquor. On the night Eliza died, the police heard Aboriginal people making noises on the road around 9 p.m, which may have been after curfew for the Aboriginal people there. Constable James O'Shea testified that he saw, quote, a black fella and a black gin. When I first saw them, the black gin was lying on the ground with the clothes up over her head, and the black fellow was lying on the top of her or beside her. And Constable Harrington stated that he, quote, saw a black gin lying on the road apparently drunk. On seeing the constable approaching, the Aboriginal man with Eliza at the time jumped up, picked up a stone in his hand and ran. Constables O'Shea and Harrington both chased the Aboriginal man until O'Shea, quote, struck him, caught him by the hair of the head and took the stone off him with the assistance of Harrington. I then told him to go to his camp. I then asked Harrington, where was the gin? At this time, Harrington stated that he, quote, looked back and saw the black gin get up and attempt to run towards the schoolhouse, which was in the same direction her body was found. The two constables set out looking for a body, returned to where they had first seen her on the road. There were a number of mining holes about. They said we looked in several before we found her. Both constables also testified that they did not, quote, strike any or the gin last night or see anyone else strike her or cause her injury. O'Shea also stated, quote, I did not see anyone throw the gin down the hole. I don't know how she got down. John Smith, a local miner, assisted police by going down the hole to retrieve Eliza's body. Smith found the body of the, quote, black woman lying on her face and hands and was lying the full length of the shaft. She was not dead then. He states that he assisted police with taking her body to the police station. There are enough projections in the shaft to give a wound to anything striking against them. I was down the shaft this afternoon and could find no trace of blood. You can see in 2 or 3 places where she has come against it. William Thomas Cuthbert, the government medical officer, was called upon by Constable O'Shea to attend a black gin near the state school, which he said was either smashed up, dead or dying. After viewing her body at the Ravenswood police station, Dr. Cuthbert noticed 2 lacerated and contused scalp wounds and a punctured wound and a depressed fracture in the neighbourhood of the junction of the parietal and occipital bones, which was, in my opinion, the cause of death, together with the shock she must have received from the precipitation into the fall. Polly, a 9-year-old domestic servant, worked for Mrs. Hobbs and her mother, Mrs. Bell of Woody Point, Redcliffe. Mrs. Hobbs and her mother had known Polly all her life, as she lived in the Aboriginal camp only 5 metres from their property. Clanger and visited regularly. On the night of the 8th of March, 1891, Polly asked Mrs. Hobbs if she could, quote, stay in the kitchen for the night, as it was too late to go to her camp 3 miles off, and this was about 7 o'clock p.m. Mrs. Hobbs gave her the permission asked. During the evening of the 8th, Polly was worried as she saw, quote, a black fellow come into the kitchen and take the teapot off the stove and drink from it. The next morning at 1:30 a.m., Mrs. Hobbs was awoken, quote, by screams or yells from our groundsman, Tom Jackson. I rushed to the back veranda in the direction of the noise. Almost immediately, Polly climbed onto the veranda from the garden outside. I noticed blood on her jacket. She said, oh, black fellow with Tom. A black fellow with Tom. He wanted to take me long of him. Me fright and run to Tom's door and hammer. Mrs. Hobbs did not notice any wound on Polly, as she seemed herself. She then asked, Polly, you hurt? She replied, Tom hit me, not much. Think me black fellow. When Mrs. Hobbs questioned Tom, what's all this? She noticed he was wearing a shirt and trousers but no shoes. Tom always wore shoes, which supports the testimony that his wife had woken him and he had rushed to save Polly, quote, from a black fella in the kitchen. On the night of the incident, he had tried to strike the black fellow under the house with his unloaded gun, but hit one of the stumps on the house instead so hard that he almost took it out. When he came out from under the house, he, quote, saw something coming close, then swung the gun barrel around and hit something which fell. I heard police cry, oh, Tom, you have hit me. But she got up and followed me towards the kitchen. We did not think much of the child's hurt, but at night she seemed delirious. At 9 a.m. the next morning, Polly showed Mrs. Hobbs, quote, a cut behind her ear about an inch in length, which had been bleeding quite profusely and was still bleeding. Mrs. Hobbs put a bandage on the cut, however, Polly complained of her neck being sore below the cut. The next day, Mrs. Hobbs found another cut above the dressed cut, under her hair. Ernest Sanford Jackson, quote, the medical superintendent of the Brisbane Hospital, admitted an Aboriginal female child aged 9 years named Polly on the 17th of March. 3 days later, when he saw her again, quote, she was suffering from a large depressed fracture of the skull behind the left ear, together with a wound about 1.5 inches in length. At the time, she could answer a few questions, but was only partially unconscious. On the 22nd of March, Polly was given the operation of trephining, which you can see in the image here, which was to relieve bleeding on the brain, by Dr. Thompson after her health declined, and on the 12th of April, she finally died of exhaustion. After post-mortem examination, her cause of death was determined to be, quote, exhaustion consequence on inflammation of the brain due to the fracture of the skull, appeared to have been caused by a heavy blow from some blunt instrument. Polly was 9 years old. Lily Limburner was born in Townsville in 1909 to Rosie and Jack Burke. At the age of 25, she married Ernest, or Ernie Limburner, a half-caste at the Palm Island Aboriginal settlement, and at the time of marriage, Lily had 2 illegitimate children, Samuel Burke, about 18 years of age, and Lucky Burke, about 15 years. At the Palm Island settlement, Lily and Ernest lived at the Cooktown end of the island, while the 2 boys lived in the single men's barracks, and Lily's work involved household duties. 2 months before Lily died, trouble with her began over Ernest's gambling habit and him arriving home late at night. During these nights out, Ernest would also meet Laurie Thompson, a married woman on the island, quote, in the scrub, and had connections with her on lots of times, sometimes once a week and sometimes twice a week, for easy over 12 months. On Friday, the 4th of August 1944, the night before her death, Ernest had gone to Charlie Palmer's house to play cards with a large group of people, including Laurie, her husband, and a boy. When the game was over, Ernest walked out. Lily saw Laurie walk out with her family, followed by Ernest, and said, "What are you doing walking out with that woman?" Ernest replied, "I walked out behind her and her husband." Lily hit Ernest in the temple with one of her shoes and then pulled and ripped his shirt. On several occasions, Ernie refers to waiting for Lily to cool down because, quote, she was a woman with a very bad temper who got into mad fits growling. After quarrelling with Ernie that night, Lily threatened to fix him up if he didn't come home. Returning from his father's house 15 minutes later, Ernie could, quote, smell fuel, kerosene. We used kerosene regularly to light the fire. I thought Lily had made the fire. I walked into the house and Lily was inside the bedroom, dressed in a Milanese petticoat and singlet and panties. She asked me for a cigarette and I put it down in front of her as I went to the lavatory. I saw a flare of light. Lily sang out to me. Her clothes were lighted up the front. She smelled of kerosene. When Laurie learnt of Lily's death, she stated, quote, I heard that Lily had died, and I cried for Lily, as I was sorry for her. I think Lily burnt herself for Ernie go with me. Constable John Edward Osborne of the CI branch, Townsville, stated in his findings, quote, Lily Limburner met her death as a result of pouring kerosene on the front of her dress and setting fire to herself. I'm convinced that she did not intend to cause her death in this manner, but that she performed this act in a means of bravado, owing to the fact that she was jealous of her husband carrying on with the Aboriginal woman, Laurie Thompson, and because of her husband's gambling. Lily was 35 years old. Shirley McTavish, a half-caste, was born on Palm Island in 1924 to John Bundy, now deceased, and who was then deceased, and Emily Gala. On the 6th of March 1943, she married Mick McTavish at Palm Island, and he encouraged her to go and work for Zigzag Holding in Ewan. After leaving the island for Townsville, while waiting for the mail bus, Shirley went out with other men at night. Mick talks about speaking to her about her conduct, and she said she wanted to come back to Palm Island. Mick arranged with the protector at Townsville for her to come back and said he went to the job. When Shirley eventually went to work at Zigzag Holding, she only stayed for a week because, quote, she did not like the place. I had a quarrel with her. She had a violent temper and threatened to kill herself with an axe. After Mick separated from Shirley, she was then sent to teach in the suspect leper village of Pencil Bay, as her profession was a teacher. On several occasions, Mick refers to Shirley, quote, having a very bad temper and threatening to poison or kill herself. On Monday, the 22nd of January 1945, Shirley had wanted James or Jamesy Clifford, a 32-year-old half-caste man and suspect leper with whom she had been sweethearts, to come to her. James had been working away from Shirley as, quote, she used to get into a very bad temper, and when she was in a temper, she was dangerous. This night, she took James's blankets from his hut and put them in her own, so he would have to visit her. She called out for him to come and get his blankets and to, quote, not take the blankets away when he attempted to do so. At this time, James called out to the Constable Phillips, a native policeman stationed at Pencil Bay, to arrest Shirley and come over to where he was and to make her let me go. After Shirley caught James again, Constable Phillips arrested them both, but Shirley, quote, refused to come to the settlement, but asked to be allowed to go to a hut to change her clothes. Once back in his hut, James heard screaming, and when he came outside, he, quote, saw Shirley with her hair on fire. Constable Phillips also adds that when Shirley requested to go back to her hut, she, quote, asked me, can I go in and dress? As she was only wearing a petticoat at this time. She closed the door. I saw the deceased run out all the light. When she came out, she still had a bottle in her hand. I later examined the bottle, and it smelt of kerosene. In his summary of Shirley's death, the superintendent of Palm Island Aboriginal Settlement noted that even though Pencil Bay was a suspect leper settlement, quote, the deceased was not a suspect leper, but due to her promiscuous character in the past, she was put into the dormitory on occasions for her immorality. On one occasion, quote, she was in the quarters about 18 months. She drank disinfectant in a fit of temper and had to receive hospital treatment. The coroner found her cause of death to be owing to the arrest of James Clifford and deceased in a fit of uncontrollable temper due to thwarted passion. She committed suicide by throwing kerosene over her clothes and set fire to them on the night of the 22nd. Shirley was 21 years old. Winnie Brown, daughter of Aboriginal Willie and half-caste Hetty, was born in 1892 at the Aboriginal camp at Giggum Dam near Maryborough. As part of her daily chores, Winnie would visit Mrs. Smith at the nearby Mount Joseph property for fresh meat and other food items. On the morning of the 26th of July 1907, she set out alone on her daily errand of visiting Mrs. Smith to collect meat and bicarbonate of soda for her father. She also asked, quote, Mrs. Smith to write a letter to David Kelly, a half-caste Aboriginal who was working at Miva, 25 miles or 40 kilometres from Giggamdan, to come over to see her father who was sick. On her second visit to Mrs. Smith between 2 p.m. and 3 p.m, she took a little sister Marion, and Mrs. Smith checked if Winnie's mother wanted both Kelly and an Aboriginal man named Cobbo. She returned to Mrs. Smith at 4 p.m. to tell her that, quote, Kelly alone was wanted, and Mrs. Smith commented, quote, she noticed nothing wrong with the girl Winnie, but noticed she was eating underripe locusts and told her it would make her sick. The next morning, after returning from Mrs. Smith's property, Winnie became very ill, had a sore back, and stated to her mother on the 29th of July, 3 days later, quote, you know that big iron bark tree? You know Cobbo, mother? When I was coming back from Mrs. Smith's with the meat, I saw Cobbo behind the iron bark tree and tried to run back to Smith's, and he blocked me and ran me towards the fence. When I was getting through, Cobbo caught me and pulled me back. He put his foot on my chest and kicked me in the back and then lifted my dress and lay on top of me. When he had finished, I got up. Cobbo said, do not tell your mother and father or I will kill you straight away, for they will put me in the lockup. The suggestion that Cobbo was the culprit can be found in the witness testimonies of Willie, Hetty, Winnie's maternal grandmother Bally, and Dr. Penny. However, the doctor also states, quote, he found girl had been raped with torn vagina and inflammation of womb and appendages and peritonitis. The latter I thought not sufficient to produce death in 48 hours. And a suspicion of strychnine poisoning, which was the result of the position in which I found the body, which was borne out by the statements made to me that she seemed to have taken a dog babe, which was meat laced with strychnine poisoning to kill wild dogs. When the half-caste David Kelly makes his witness testimony, quote, he solemnly declares that Black Boy Cobbo was working with him at Miva on Friday 26th of July, the day the offence was committed, and that Mr. Atherton, his white boss, could affirm the same, and that he considers it impossible for Cobbo to be the culprit. In addition to this, the government medical officer, Dr. Penny, Dr. Penny examined Winning's body and stated, quote, if a girl had voluntary connection with a man, I should expect to find some injury considering her tender age. It is possible that the results of the injury received while she was being raped would be intensified by the results of eating unripe locusts or any unripe fruit. Dr. Penny also noted, quote, strong suspicions of strychnine poisoning, which is why he sent a sealed jar containing Winnie's stomach to the government analyst in Brisbane. After the government analyst, Mr. Henderson, examined her stomach, his findings simply state, quote, I find no strychnine or other poisons in the stomach. Even though there is no evidence of strychnine in Winnie's stomach, Dr. Penny officially states that her, quote, cause of death was acute peritonitis due to lacerations of the vagina and inflammation of uterus and appendages, the result of rape, strong suspicions of strychnine poisoning. Winnie was 15 years old. Emily Dunn, my great-great-great-great-grandmother, was born in Jalaka, southwest Queensland in 1860. Her mother was Aboriginal from Budgeri peoples and only known as Carolyn, while her father, Stephen Scraggs, was an English farm labourer who came out to Australia in 1844. The inquest into Emily's death provides the witness statements of the property owner, Joseph Fian, the stockman, James Hogan, Constable Samuel Allison, and her African-Irish husband, Henry, also known as Harry Dunn. Details of Emily's inquest file were published in the Queenslander, September 13, 1890, which stated, quote, Emily Dunn, a half-caste while under the influence of liquor, took strychnine and died from its effects on the 4th instant, or 4th of September, at Beechhill Station. The manager of Beechhill Station, Mr. Joseph Fian's testimony, marked the beginning of the investigation into her death, where Fian stated, when I last saw her on the evening of the 4th, she appeared to be under the influence of spirits. I heard no quarrelling at their camp. On the evening of Emily's death, statements made by the 4 witnesses discuss her visiting the property owner, Josephine, at 9:15 p.m. to have 2 letters written for her that night as she was illiterate. The first letter is to her eldest child, daughter Mary Ann, my Granny Hearn, and the second letter is to her brother. She drank 2 bottles of spirits between 9 p.m. and 10 p.m. and offered the alcohol to some Aboriginal people who were nearby their camp. This is reiterated in all 4 witness statements where they record Emily being, quote, under the influence of liquor. There is also her husband Henry who stated, quote, she asked me to come to her. I refused to do so as she had a flick, which is a small knife, in her hand. I refused to go to her, being afraid of her when she is under the influence of drink. Henry also states that Emily threatened to go down to the creek and poison herself. Found by her husband and the stockman James Hogan writhing on the ground in a fit of spasms at 11 p.m, she was dead by 4 a.m. the next morning. Constable Samuel Allison of Yulo Police Station conducted the investigation into her death, and then she was buried. He presents his inquest findings in the following words. On the 6th of September, I received a report from Josephine of Beechell Station that on the night of the 4th instant, Mrs. Dunn, wife of Harry Dunn, had taken strychnine and died from the effects of the same on the morning of the 5th. I recognised the face as that of Emily Dunn. The corpse was so much decomposed I could not say whether there were any marks of violence on the body. Mr. Josephine, Harry Dunn, James Hogan and I took the body up and buried it. From inquiries I have made, I have reason to believe she died from the effects of poison, which she had taken voluntarily. Emily was 30 years old. Lizzie Buffum, a 17-year-old Aboriginal nurse girl, had been employed by Mary Wire and her husband, Police Sergeant Joseph Wire, for 12 months to look after their children, Annie, 11 years, Christopher, aged 4, and a baby nearly 2 years old. After treating Annie roughly one afternoon by, as Annie stated, pulling me over the veranda rails and choking me, Lilia responded with, quote, now you shamed me, I'll go and take poison. Lizzie died on the 1st of December 1905 after consuming the Poison Street's white ant cure, which was used to kill white ants and termites in houses. Mrs. Y, in her witness testimony, clearly states that Lizzie was very kind and careful with the children, and Annie was her favourite and does not understand Lizzie's decision to commit suicide. Interestingly, though, she also states that she never knows anything about the girl except she had, quote, a passionate temper. Annie Wire, Mrs. Wire's 11-year-old daughter, gave sworn testimony on the 11th of December, stating, quote, I was standing on the veranda at 2 p.m. talking to a schoolmate, and the girl Lizzie Buffum was standing near me. Lizzie caught hold of me and put me over the rails of the veranda onto the ground. She put me over and pulled me up again and put me over the rails a second time. She put me over near the steps and I fell on the ground near the posts. I hurt my right eye. There was a lump on it. I then ran down underneath the house crying. No one came into the house. I got on very well with Lizzie. She never spoke of taking poison before. I know of no reason why she should take poison. I had no quarrel with her. Mother never scolded her. William Houston, first class constable, stated, I remember Friday the 1st of December. On arriving at the house, Mrs. Mary Wire pointed out the dead body of a half-caste girl named Lizzie Buffum. The body was on its back, laid on blankets under the house. I examined the body but could not see any sexual marks or bruises on it. Mrs. Wire handed me a tin of Street's white ant cure. It was labelled poison. Dr. Samuel Patrick O'Brien stated, quote, the cause of death was irritant poisoning. As far as my observations went, there was no appearance of pregnancy, and I am satisfied from what I did observe that if pregnant, it could have only been in the early stages. The breast showed no symptoms of pregnancy. Lizzie was 17 years old. Grace Rolfe, a 19-year-old domestic servant, was born in Longreach in 1906. From the age of 16, she worked for the Dowie family at Lumley Station via Isisford, under agreement with the Protector of Aboriginals of Longreach, and she had been in their service for 3 years, from 1922 until her death on the 22nd of August 1925. Grace was 6.5 months pregnant with a male child with no identified father of the baby when she died. In an inquest file, her employees, Mr. and Mrs. Dowie, their daughter, their 2 sons, 1 son's wife, and the male bookkeeper give witness statements. Through their testimonies, Grace is described as a shy girl, a very intelligent girl for an Aboriginal who could both read and write, someone who appeared happy and content, never seemed to ever be inclined to speak to a man beyond a few words, and she was not a fast girl and was never seen out with a boy. Both the Dowie sons in their witness statements mention the term fast girl, which is a term defined in an 1874 slang dictionary to mean a woman who has lost her respect for men and for whom men have lost their respect. The Dowie family made it clear, quote, that they always treated Grace well. They could not suggest any particular man who may have been responsible for her pregnant condition. She was always under strict control, always appeared to be in good health, and never complained of feeling sick, was never left alone on Lumley Station, and never threatened or suggested she would take her own life. John Joseph Dowie, the owner of Lumley Station and a Justice of the Peace for Queensland, stated that strychnine was kept on the property to poison dogs and crows. The bottles were stored 8 feet above the floor in a wall plate of the storeroom, which was not locked. Prior to Grace's death, seals on the 2 bottles of strychnine in the storeroom were intact, but when found after Grace's death, quote, the seal was broken. Once Mr. Dowie saw Grace fitting and twitching on the bed, he, quote, considered that a symptom showed that she had swallowed poison of some kind. As regards her death, there was no doubt that Grace Robb committed suicide by taking strychnine, and the only motive that I can think of her for doing this was her pregnant condition. All her money and belongings have been forwarded to the Protector of Aboriginals at Longreach. It seems curious that Grace could be so far into her pregnancy, yet no one on the property where she worked could ascertain how she fell pregnant. The witnesses suggest that the father of the baby must be an Aboriginal man named Eli, aged 60 to 65 years old, who worked on Lumley Station, or one of the Indian hawkers camped at Lumley where she would go to buy things. The Lumley Station bookkeeper, 26-year-old Michael O'Dwyer, stated under oath that, quote, during January, February and March of 1925, 3 Indian hawkers were camped at Lumley Station near the homestead for about a week. I never noticed Grace Robb visit these hawkers on her own, but it would be possible for her to do so without my seeing her. 3 days prior to her death, Mrs. Dowie asked Grace if she is pregnant and who is responsible for her condition. Grace's response is denial, silence, and a resounding no. At the very moment of Grace's death, Mrs. Dowie asks her what's wrong as she twitches spasmodically on the bed, and she responds twice with, leave me alone. Grace was 19 years old. Brennan, a half-caste, was born 21st of December 1896 and died on the 22nd of August 1910 at Pattonswell, Georgetown, North Queensland, of a bullet wound to the head thought to be suicide. In her inquest, witness testimonies are provided by her white father, Thomas Brennan, her white stepmother, Mary Ellen Johnson, her white stepbrother, Jack Johnson, 3 Tweedside miners, 2 constables, and the government medical officer, Dr. Money. On the morning of her death, Sissy and Jack were sent by their father, Thomas Brennan, at 8 a.m, quote, to catch a horse and come back to camp. Jack was sent, quote, to catch a mare and also go into town for a parcel and other things alone. At 11 a.m, Charles Camp, a local miner, noticed his gun was missing because he was going to clean it. After he saw Jack with the rifle, he took it off him, but Jack told him that Sissy had taken it. After missing Sissy as it was getting very late, Brennan assumed she went to town with Jack, not meant to. But when he arrived at the well, he noticed the bucket to water the horses was missing, and on looking for it, noticed Sissy lying dead 7 yards or 6.4 metres to the south of the well. The body was lying on its back, head well back, dressed down to her knees, and did not appear to have been disturbed. Constable Johnson was informed of the occurrence, and when Brennan arrived at the well at 5 p.m, the body appeared to have been dead for 4 to 5 hours. Examination of the evidence as recorded in Sissy's certificate of particulars from the police report and medical officer's report, including post-mortem examination of her body, reveals a more complicated story. For example, Dr. Percy Money stated in his findings that, quote, deceased has never had any practice with a rifle or a firearm and had no knowledge of them. Brennan says his father thinks the cause of death was accidental. He did not think the girl was murdered. He thinks the girl did it herself accidentally. Jack Johnson, Sissy's stepbrother, gave a 14-page testimony in Sissy's inquest and talked several times about a young unnamed man who came to the well for water. Johnson said the last time Sissy met the man was 5 days before she died. The story about the unnamed mysterious man at the well, together with other surprising details provided by Jack, include what he did when he found Sissy's dead body. Jack states, I was on the left side between the body and the trees. I bent down and took the rifle off the arm and then went round by the head and took the bullet out of her right hand. The hand was closed. I did not open the hand. I took the rifle and bullet away because they belonged to Mr. Camp. I was going to put them back in the battery. I didn't want Camp to see them because he would growl at me. Jack's exculpatory statements about removing the rifle and bullet cartridge from Sissy's dead body to avoid getting into trouble with Mr. Camp excused him from any suspicion of wrongdoing. At least one of the initial news reports of her death described Brennan finding the dead body of his daughter, quote, with a bullet wound through her head and a rifle lying across her arm. However, as revealed during the inquiry itself, Brennan had found Sissy's body at Pattonswell late in the afternoon, hours after Jack had already returned Charles Camp's rifle. Constable Johnson was informed of the matter at 7:30 p.m. and he found no evidence of violence in the Virginia or vagina. The only evidence of violence is in the crown of the head and inside the mouth. From deceased's tracks, he was of opinion that deceased was in a sitting position at the time of the explosion in her mouth. Sissy was 13 years old. Biddy Lyndale, aged 16 to 17 years old, aged 16 to 17 years, of Atherton, died on the 23rd of February 1917 from a bullet perforating the heart, with evidence suggesting it was suicide. In an inquest, 2 constables, Biddy's employer, Mrs. Lyndale, the neighbour of her employer, Mrs. Giblett, and an Aboriginal boy named Jimmy Lyndale, who also worked for Mrs. Lyndale, provide witness testimonies. Constable Nielsen stated, quote, about 1:30 p.m. in the company of Constable Ridge and Dr. Maswell, I proceeded to the bank of the creeks within a short distance of Biddy Lyndale's house. I then saw the deceased body lying on the creek bed, banked with what appeared to be a bullet wound and a dark mark around the wound, which looked like a burnt powder mark. Her body was removed to the hospital morgue, where later that night I was present when Dr. Maswell conducted the post-mortem examination. I saw him extract a bullet that was embedded near the 7th rib on the left side. He stated, I made careful inquiries and am satisfied that the wound which caused death was self-inflicted and that it was a case of suicide. Constable Bernard Gormley's testimony highlights another potential reason for the evidence points to suicide theory. He states, quote, I knew the deceased Aboriginal girl, Biddy Lyndale. On the night of the 22nd, there were pictures on at the Shire Hall at Atherton. I know a half-caste boy who was there that night, Tommy Purcell, and Biddy was there too. They had been seeing each other, how after interval Tommy left with another girl, Daisy Compain. 20 minutes later, Biddy left the hall and walked up and down the road. She spoke to me about Tommy and said that he is with her and shouldn't be going out with another girl. She had seen him leave with Daisy. She appeared to be very excited and troubled about the occurrence. She then went back into the hall. I didn't see Biddy, Tommy or Daisy for the rest of the night. I heard next day of deceased's death. Jimmy Lyndale, an Aboriginal worker for Mrs. Lyndale and the last person to see Biddy alive, stated in his testimony, quote, I'm about 12 or 13 years of age, living with Mr. and Mrs. Lyndale, and I knew the deceased Biddy Lyndale. I remember the 23rd of February, we went down to the creek and she sat down on the grass with a rifle in her hand. She said, Jimmy, you go up and get some bananas and I will stay here. She was fooling with the gun, pulling the lever back as if to load and pointed it towards her chest. When I told her to leave it down, she turned it the other way, but then turned it back towards her chest again. That was the last position I saw her in, with the gun pointing to her chest. I then went on picking bananas and I next heard the rifle go off. I came down from the tree and saw there was a red stain on her chest. She was breathing then. I took hold of the gun, opened the breech and took the empty shell out and then dropped the gun again. The shell fell into the grass, which is about a foot long. I've since tried to find the shell but could not. I think it was an accident that Beattie shot herself. Beattie was almost 17 years old. Jessie Leopold, a 23-year-old widow, died of a gunshot wound to the head at Meteor Downs Station where she worked as a domestic servant. Jessie's certificate of particulars stated that she died in unusual circumstances. However, there were no suspicious circumstances, and it was thought that she, quote, took her own life. The inquest file includes the testimonies of the owner of Meteor Downs, the Aboriginal station cook, one constable, and the government medical officer, Dr. Flynn. Jeremiah Joseph John George Millard, manager of Meteor Downs Cattle Station, situated 28 miles or 45 kilometres from Springshaw, stated, quote, I knew the deceased Jessie Leopold. She was working at Meteor Downs under an agreement with the Chief Protector of Aboriginals. She has been working here for the past 9 months. When deceased came to work at the station, there was another Abo girl working here, Mavis Richardson. These two girls were very friendly. There were also 3 Abo boys working on the station. Deceased was not very friendly with them. She wouldn't speak unless she was spoken to. Deceased was a good worker. I never had to speak to her regarding her work. She never asked for permission to go to Warrabinda to see her mother. She never complained to me that she was sick or worried. Jemima Leopold was employed as a cook, and Jemima always kept a pea rifle in the kitchen for the purpose of shooting crows. I have often seen a rifle in the kitchen. I've never seen the deceased using the rifle. I've seen Jemima using it. The last time I saw deceased alive was on the evening of the 20th of October. It was crossed out, restated. The last time I saw the deceased on the 20th of October was in the evening when she was washing up the tea thing. On the morning of the 21st, I got out of bed about daylight. After I lit the fire, I went up to the men's quarters to call them and give them the orders for the day. I went out and called her, but as she did not answer, I pushed open the door of deceased room, which was closed but not locked. When I entered deceased room, I saw her lying across the bed with her head resting against the wall and her feet hanging over the side of the bed. She was fully dressed with the exception of her shoes. I saw that deceased had blood on her forehead as she was breathing very slowly. I saw that blood was also coming from her nose. I saw a small hole in deceased's forehead between the eyes. There were black marks all around the wound. I saw a rifle standing butt down on the floor with its barrel leaning against the bed between her left leg and her left hand. The black marks around the wound on her forehead would indicate the rifle was held very close to the forehead when it was fired. I know of no suspicious circumstances surrounding deceased's death, and in my opinion, deceased took her own life by shooting herself in the forehead, with the rifle now produced in court. Harry Gilbert, cook, police constable of Springshaw, stated, after Mavis left, she frequently asked permission to visit Warrabinda, but this was refused. She also worried about, in referring to Jessie, she also worried about her mother at Warrabinda because she never wrote to her. Further inquiries have revealed that deceased mother was mentally subnormal, and some years ago she was taken to a mental asylum. She was discharged from the asylum and subsequently came to Springshaw, but because she had to be removed to the Warrabinda settlement because of her ongoing condition, where she would be continually kept under observations. And from my inquiry, same thing again, I'm of the opinion that the wounds around the deceased's death, the wounds which were the cause of deceased's death were self-inflicted and probably brought about the deceased worrying at her mother's failure to write to her and the fact that she was refused permission to visit Warrabinda to see her mother. In the moments prior to death, each of these 11 Aboriginal women and girls is alive, speaking, moving, acting and reacting. They are present as daughters, sisters, wives and mothers in their inquests, and yet they are marked as Aboriginal, the mark upon their bodies. As Shireen Razak argues, for more than a simple mark of inferiority, the branding mark of dysfunction is emblazoned on the flesh, but given full meaning in the inquest, the place where we learn what death means. If bodies that bear this faithful X and X marked on the epidermis are beyond care, the inquest confirms that the state and settlers have nonetheless done all that could be done with such a difficult population. In my PhD project, Aboriginal female agency and resistance is always present inside the settler colonial structure, fracturing, rupturing and dismantling from within the normalised everyday domestic spaces to unsettle the settler colonial through actions, reactions, decisions and embodied silence. My aim in the thesis is to give sorrow words, to unsettle the settler, to say their names, and to remind the settler colonial that, quote, "You will never know her fully, never know us, never know. You will never know her fully,